Okay, I think it's in here somewhere. Let's have a look. Yes. Found it. It's the BTR5. Don't know if it's charged, but, well, it's there. BTR5, BTR7, BTR17. So FiiO has done it again. They've come out with yet another Bluetooth DAC and amp. And just to clarify, because people do ask me this in the comments on my videos, this device is for hooking up a pair of wired headphones or in-ear monitors, thus, with a fancy 4.4mm socket if so desired, and then have it connect wirelessly to a phone or computer or whatever. So no wire, yes wire. And sometimes people ask me, hey, I have some Bluetooth headphones, will this improve the sound quality? No, you need better Bluetooth headphones or wired headphones to improve. However, the BTR17, like the BTR7 and BTR5 before it, can be connected via USB, and for which they even include a fancy USB cable, to a phone or similar, if so desired, thus, and act like a dongle DAC or a little DAC for a PC or something like that. So you do have a lot of flexibility. And I think unlike the previous devices they've had, they've improved the USB input quality here so that you still get good quality sound and not that harsh and edgy sound you get from non-isolated or kind of noisy USB that you did, say, with the BTR5. So in that, I did most of my testing via USB, although it works fine via Bluetooth audio, especially if you have a device that has LDAC or LDAC output. My iPhone, for example, only has AAC, and so it wasn't quite as good. But I wanted to evaluate the sound quality in kind of absolute terms anyway, so I used it mostly via USB. Speaking of that, it comes with this fancy looking USB cable. Now really these audiophile USB cables are kind of bullcrap, and not for the normal reasons that people argue. The thing is, USB, being a digital connector, has specific characteristics it has to meet to stop, well, issues with it. The sending device and the receiving device and the cable all have to have what's called a characteristic impedance, and don't worry about what that is, but basically it has to be a 90 ohm cable. And even this fancy OE audio cable with nicely shielded plugs uses a standard USB cable here because it will have the correct characteristic impedance. This absolutely will not. Now it is nice and flexible, so I did, for example, if I was moving things around, didn't get any disconnects from when I was using my phone, whereas this stiffer OE audio one sometimes pulled on the plug just enough to cause a disconnect. So while it probably won't have any negative effect ultimately, yeah, it's kind of, fancy braided audio USB cables are nonsense, but yeah, because they're not to spec more than anything. Still, I mean, if you want to go fancy, there are some of my friends like this fast gear cable for some reason, which, anyway, let's not go there. Okay, but anyway, the main thing is some of the features of the BTR17 versus the BTR7 have been upgraded. For example, if we go in here, well, one of the obvious ones is you have a rotary encoder volume. Much better than pressing buttons on the side. The other thing is you have 3 different modes. Now, if you remember the BTR7, it had the option for charging on or off depending on whether you're connected to a phone or not. Now, with the BTR17, Bluetooth option is manually selected, whereas you have a phone mode, which does not charge the device through the normal USB port, and the PC mode, in which it will. Now, there's one other thing it does in those modes, and that's obvious if you look at the bottom. There are 2 USB ports, rather like the K17, where it has the USB input port and then a power port. And the reason for that is you can provide extra power to the BTR17 for when you want to drive, maybe have better headphone drive, for example. Now the USB input port will act like a normal USB input port and will charge or not charge depending on the setting on the side, PC or phone mode. Whereas in, say, phone mode, where it's not charging through USB or providing extra power through USB, you can provide power separately through the power in port. And I did that using a normal charger that I use for charging half my devices, just to see, and then I kind of experimented with something which is much lower noise to see if that made a difference. A little tiny bit, but maybe not much. Not enough for me to make a big deal about it. All the same means that If you want to use your phone, say, as a USB music source without draining the phone, you can use some kind of external battery pack or USB input to provide extra power if so desired. But would you desire to do that? Well, I'll explore that in the sound, but there are a couple of more cool features I want to show you first. For example, if we go into the menus by long pressing the volume control, I'm on version 1.1, just so you know, where they just added the functionality of having the mic available for it, because the very earliest adopters of FiiO products tend to be missing features or have bugs, but yeah, that's a FiiO thing. You have two gain levels, low and high, as usual. You have a bunch of digital filters for which I couldn't really notice any kind of difference. I think the stock one, the normal one, is minimum of phase. If you notice a difference, play around with it. Some people maybe might, some people don't. One of the cool things though they have is PEQ mode. Now this is not just like your normal thing where you have jazz, pop, rock, standard ones, but there are 10 programmable user presets which you can do with external software, and you can program in an EQ as you desire for your particular pair of headphones or your car or whatever, what have you, as necessary, and you can store them on this, which I think is a pretty handy thing, especially if you're like me and sometimes you want maybe a profile with a bit more bass or a bit less treble or maybe a slight adjustment in the vocal area. You can select either 60 or 120 volume steps, maybe 60 if you're using full-sized headphones or 120 if you're using IEMs. If you like a bit more fine-grained volume control or faster volume ramp up and down, it's your choice. Max volume, obviously, handy maybe if you're giving it to a child or you are like me and sometimes have very sensitive IEMs where, let's say, accidentally setting it a volume level too high would result in a lot of pain. One of the cool things they've added is a feature you normally have in DAPs, which is charge protection. So with charge protection on, it limits the battery charge to 80 or 90% so that it will not degrade the battery so fast if you're hoping to keep this for a long time. And you can turn it off when you want a full charge for, say, using on public transport or long ride somewhere. Obviously you have 5 brightness levels, which is handy if you're daytime or dark room nighttime kind of thing. Leave it on the middle one for now. Up to 30 seconds of screen timeout, which is handy. Always have it at 30 for making videos. One of the cool things is you can have screen rotation now. So you can have the screen rotate in whatever direction you like for use if you sometimes use it sideways, for example. Up to you. And you have the good old car mode where it will power on or off depending on whether there's power going through the USB port, automatically powering off when it loses power after I think about 20 or 30 seconds or something like that. And that's very handy for using in a car or similar setup. The rest is fairly straightforward. And it's pretty much as you'd expect any kind of device, which is Bluetooth or dongle DAC. Except one other little feature I really like is the back of the BTR7 has this glass back, which looked fancy, but kind of slid around in your desk and would often pulled it off or it fell off. Although you could put it in its case to kind of avoid that. The BTR17 has this kind of vinyl back, which is, well, it's not sticky. It doesn't slide quite as easily, which I think works out a little bit better. And with that, well, let's get into this sound quality. Now, FiiO tends to have something of a house sound with these devices, and that really hasn't changed. Despite that they're using a ESS 9068 rather than the phone type DACs that they were using in the BTR7, it still has something of a sharp and maybe slightly edgy sound to it, which the BTR5 had, BTR7 had. You have much the same kind of thing. Where the difference is in the amplification. The BTR7 had a THX amp, which sounded pretty decent, but a touch flat maybe. The BTR7's amplifier sounds somewhat more dynamic, which means you get more kind of excitement out of the sound, although it does end up sounding a bit forced. For example, I used a couple of pairs of headphones with it. I wanted to try an easy to drive pair of headphones, but something very resolving so I could get an idea of the overall sound, which was Focal's 2022 Utopias. Not a combination you tend to use, but mainly just for evaluation. The other was Dan Clark Audio's E3s, which are much harder to drive, having a lower impedance and also much lower sensitivity. And they tend to be very challenging for stuff to drive, and it really strains the amplifiers up enough that you can get an idea of how well they perform. And I also compared it to FiiO's M11 Plus, which I also have here, to give you an idea how it is versus a DAP. Now in that, especially with the E3s, it was noticeable that while the sound quality at the same level just using battery power was similar between both the BTR7 and 17, there was a touch more dynamic from the BTR17 versus the BTR7. It wasn't a huge difference, but a little bit more sharper and dynamic all the same. But when you put on desktop mode, that's when things jumped up, probably of course helped by the fact that it's louder. Even turning the volume down to about the same level, it still sounded sharper and more dynamic, but it sounded a little bit forced in how it did it. And it was very noticeable how kind of forced sounding this was, and it's very similar to kind of the forced sound that the KA17 has. In that, when you switch to a DAP, the DAP just sounded like the dynamics came through smoothly and easily without sounding forced, whereas the BTR7 sounded a little bit more kind of in your face, as if look at me, kind of forced sounding dynamics in there. And it sounded punchy and fun initially, but the slight edginess meant that even some things like the percussion or the sharper notes of Kurt Cobain singing, say, of Lake of Fire from the MTV Live album sounded a little bit kind of edgy and a touch grating for preference. Even some other tracks around here, you can see a bunch of the ones that I listened to. I had some Melody Gardot on a different playlist. Sounded a little bit edgy with some of the notes, plus the kind of strain of the amplification in there, even if I was using a very sufficient power supply as the extra power into the BTR17. So overall, that gave me a feeling that I like the fact that FiiO is, again, progressing with features, but if you're looking, for example, for something that you're going to use all the time, well, if it has to be small and compact, this could be quite fun sounding, especially with something even quite decent like, say, Mez's Lyrics or Poets, which are $2,000 headphones. I'd probably pick something for preference as a slightly darker sounding, again, maybe Mez's Poets, or some headphones which are not so bright and edgy sounding, because the combination of that with the BTR17 might be a little bit too much. But for someone wanting better performance, you're going to have to go up to something like a portable player like this M11 Plus for best results. But in a practical use case scenario, maybe you don't have a stereo in your car that receives Bluetooth, like you have an older car, something like this is still a very handy device to have, especially if you want to kind of separate out whatever source you have, whether it be your phone, TV, computer, or whatever, and want to make it wirelessly connect to a pair of wired headphones or in-ear monitors. And while the desktop mode is a unique feature, I don't really think it truly adds to the sound quality of the BTR17, as I don't feel I was hearing more actual detail in desktop mode versus the normal mode. It just sounded more, well, sharpened if anything. Lastly, if you do consider buying one of these, in the description are links to places you can buy them, which will also help out and support this channel, as if you buy the product, and actually if you don't return it, so there's no benefit in me just trying to sell you the product, then I will get a little bit back as well. Also, if you'd like to support my reviews and see me do more of them, do consider becoming a member through Buy Me a Coffee. You'll get direct access to me, we can ask for my help, you can get previews of my videos before I release them, and you can get my impressions of products well in advance of when I make the video about them. As always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on my Discord chat.